Hailed throughout Europe as the devoted lover of a queen, the perfect symbol of chivalrous heterosexual romance. Yet his most secret letters reveal a torn soul, a man whose heart was captivated by both the rugged beauty of soldiers and the delicate charm of his noble companions. His name was Count Axel von Fersen. How was it that his secret, passionate love for men was almost erased by history, buried under the legend of his tragic love affair with a queen? To begin this story, we must first step back into his world, an era glittering on the edge of a precipice. The late 18th century in Europe was a powder keg of paradoxes. It was an age of enlightenment where the brilliant minds of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot championed reason, individual liberty, and the rights of man. Yet, this intellectual revolution flourished in the shadow of absolute monarchies, where the divine right of kings was still a formidable, if increasingly fragile, reality. Empires spanned the globe, art and philosophy reached breathtaking new heights, but beneath this glittering surface, the ancient structures of society were groaning under the pressure of inequality, poverty, and a growing hunger for change. In this world, two nations stood as the poles of Axel von Fersen's existence. The first was his homeland, Sweden. Far from being a quiet northern backwater, Sweden in the mid-18th century was a significant European power, still basking in the afterglow of its formidable military past. It was a nation caught in its own political drama, transitioning from the aristocratic rule of the Age of Liberty to the enlightened yet absolute monarchy of King Gustav III. Gustav, who ascended to the throne in 1771, was a fascinating and complex ruler. Deeply enamored with French culture, he transformed his court in Stockholm into a Paris of the North. He was a patron of the arts, the founder of the Swedish Royal Opera and the Swedish Academy, and a monarch who saw himself as a philosopher king. For a young, ambitious nobleman like Axel von Fersen, the path to influence and glory was clear. One must be educated, worldly, and above all, fluent in the language and customs of the undisputed center of the universe, France. And what a center it was! France, under the Bourbon monarchy of King Louis XVI, was the sun around which the rest of Europe revolved. It dictated fashion, art, philosophy, and diplomacy. Its court at the Palace of Versailles was a world unto itself, a breathtaking spectacle of power and extravagance, designed by Louis XIV to domesticate the French nobility and centralize his authority. By the reign of Louis XVI, however, Versailles had become a gilded cage, not only for the aristocracy but for the monarchy itself. It was a labyrinth of stifling etiquette, where every moment of the royal family's day, from waking to sleeping, was a public performance. It was a hotbed of vicious gossip, political factions, and relentless social climbing, where a misplaced word or a clumsy bow could mean social ruin. The air was thick with perfume and intrigue, a potent mix for a life as dramatic as Fersen's. Yet this opulent world was living on borrowed time. The French state was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, its coffers drained by extravagant spending and costly wars, most notably its support for the American Revolution. While the nobility enjoyed their tax exemptions and lavish lifestyles, the common people of France, the vast Third Estate, bore the crushing weight of taxation and suffered from food shortages and economic hardship. The revolutionary winds that had swept across the Atlantic were beginning to be felt in Paris, and the glittering halls of Versailles were becoming increasingly isolated from the grim realities of the nation it governed. It was into this world of grandeur, decay, simmering discontent, and intoxicating beauty that Axel von Fersen was destined to step, a man whose personal drama would become inextricably linked with the death throes of an entire social order. Count Axel von Fersen was born on September 4th, 1755, into the very apex of the Swedish aristocracy. The Fersen family was not merely noble, they were one of the most ancient, wealthy, and powerful houses in the kingdom. Their lineage was a roll call of military heroes, influential statesmen, and trusted royal counselors. To be a Fersen was to be born with the expectation of greatness. His father, Count Frederick Axel von Fersen the Elder, was a towering figure in Swedish politics and military life. A field marshal of Sweden and a leader of the aristocratic Hat Party, he was a man of immense influence, known for his sharp intellect, political acumen, and somewhat stern demeanor. His mother, Hedvig Katharina de la Gardie, was the heiress to another of Sweden's great noble families, bringing not only her prestigious lineage, but also vast estates and wealth to the marriage. From the moment of his birth, Axel was groomed for a life of leadership and service. He was not just a son, he was an heir, the carrier of his family's formidable legacy. His education was as rigorous as it was privileged. Taught by private tutors, he mastered Latin, French, German, and English, alongside history, mathematics, and the intricate arts of war and diplomacy. The values instilled in him were those of his class: honor, an unshakable code of conduct, duty to his king, his country, and his family name, and above all, discretion, the ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court life with grace and silence. This last quality would come to define his existence. His father, a man who had seen political fortunes rise and fall, understood that, in the world of high society and royal courts, what one didn't say was often more important than what one did. At the age of 15, Axel embarked on the customary grand tour, the essential finishing school for any young European aristocrat. This was no mere holiday. It was a multi-year educational pilgrimage designed to immerse him in the cultures, languages, and power structures of the continent. His journey took him through the German states, the intellectual centers of Switzerland, the artistic heart of Italy, and the political powerhouse of Great Britain. It was during this formative period that he honed the cosmopolitan Polish that would later make him so captivating. In Turin, he studied at the Regia Accademia Militare, refining his military skills. In Italy, he marveled at the ruins of Rome and the masterpieces of the Renaissance, developing a keen aesthetic sense that is evident in his later journals. Crucially, his tour brought him into contact with some of the greatest minds of the Enlightenment. In Switzerland, he had the extraordinary opportunity to meet the aging philosopher Voltaire. This encounter with the era's foremost champion of reason and wit undoubtedly left a deep impression on the young count, exposing him to the intellectual currents that were challenging the very foundations of the world he was born into. The Grand Tour shaped him into a man who was quintessentially Swedish in his loyalty and bearing, yet effortlessly European in his outlook and sophistication. It was also during these travels that we see the first hints of his meticulous nature and his deep appreciation for beauty in all its forms. His journals from this period are filled with detailed observations, not only of art and architecture, but also of the people he met. He would describe a handsome officer or a graceful young nobleman with the same aesthetic precision he applied to a Bernini sculpture, a subtle but telling foreshadowing of the complex sensibilities that lay beneath his composed exterior. In late 1773, as his grand tour was drawing to a close, Fersen made his first visit to France. He was now 18, tall and strikingly handsome, with piercing blue eyes, an aquiline nose, and an aura of quiet confidence that set him apart from the more flamboyant French courtiers. His entry into French high society was swift and seamless, facilitated by his family's name and connections. He was presented at the court of King Louis XV, a monarch in the twilight of his long and scandal-ridden reign. But it was not the aging king who commanded the court's attention. It was the young royal couple, the Dauphin, Louis Auguste, and his Austrian wife, the Dauphine Marie Antoinette. It was at a masked ball at the Paris Opera on the 30th of January 1774 that destiny intervened. The atmosphere of a masked ball was one of licensed freedom, a rare occasion where the rigid strictures of court etiquette were slightly relaxed. Behind the anonymity of a mask, conversations could be more candid, flirtations more daring. Marie Antoinette, then just 18 herself, loved these events. She was vivacious, charming, and often felt stifled by the suffocating formality of Versailles and her still unconsummated marriage to the shy and awkward Dauphin. She attended the ball with her retinue, enjoying the frisson of mingling incognito. It was there that she encountered the handsome young Swede. We can only imagine the scene, the swirl of colorful silks and satins, the shimmering candlelight, the strains of the orchestra. Their conversation began, and an immediate spark ignited between them. Fersen, unaware at first that he was speaking to the future Queen of France, treated her not as a royal, but as an intriguing and beautiful woman. There was no fawning sycophancy, no calculated flattery. Instead, he possessed a natural, respectful charm and an intelligence that she found captivating. For Marie Antoinette, who was surrounded by people who either feared her, envied her, or sought to use her, this genuine human connection was a revelation. As Fersen later wrote in his journal, "The Dauphine spoke to me for a long time without my knowing who she was. At last, when she was recognized, everybody crowded round her, and she retired into a box at 3 o'clock. I left the ball." That brief encounter left a lasting impression on both of them. Just a few months later, Louis XV died of smallpox, and the young couple ascended to the throne as King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Fersen, his grand tour concluded, returned to Sweden to begin his military career. But the memory of the enchanting Dauphine, now Queen of France, remained. For 4 years, their lives moved on separate paths. Fersen served in the Swedish army, while Marie Antoinette navigated her new role as queen, giving birth to her first child, Marie-Thérèse, and attempting to carve out a space for herself within the hostile environment of the French court. In the summer of 1778, Axel von Fersen returned to France. He was now 23, a man of the world, and he arrived with a purpose: to secure a commission in the French army, specifically with the prestigious foreign regiment, the Royal Suédois. His re-entry into Versailles was even more sensational than his first. He was no longer a touring teenager, but a confident young officer whose reputation for charm and integrity had preceded him. He was immediately welcomed back into the highest echelons of society. His reunion with Marie Antoinette was electric. The young queen, now more established but also more isolated than ever, recognized him instantly. The spark that had been lit 4 years earlier now blazed into a profound connection. She saw in him everything that was lacking in her life at court. He was brave, intelligent, and discreet. Crucially, as a foreign nobleman, he stood apart from the grasping French court factions. He wasn't seeking titles, pensions, or political influence from the French crown. His loyalty was to his own king and country. This independence made him a uniquely trustworthy confidant. He could be a friend without an agenda, an admirer without ulterior motives. Marie Antoinette soon invited Fersen into her most exclusive inner circle, the société intime that gathered at her private retreat, the Petit Trianon. This small palace within the grounds of Versailles was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the crushing formality of the main court and live, as she saw it, a simpler, more private life. To be admitted to the Petit Trianon was the ultimate sign of royal favor, and it was a privilege extended to very few, especially men. Fersen's presence there immediately set tongues wagging. The court, a snake pit of jealousy and ambition, watched their growing intimacy with malicious eyes. Theirs was a relationship that blossomed in stolen moments, quiet walks through the picturesque gardens of Trianon, shared musical evenings, and long intimate conversations. Fersen treated the queen with a unique blend of chivalrous devotion and easy familiarity. He was not intimidated by her rank, yet he never lost his profound respect for her position. For Marie Antoinette, trapped in a polite but emotionally barren marriage, Fersen offered the romantic and intellectual companionship she craved. He listened to her, he understood her, and he admired her, not just as a queen, but as a woman. The whispers at court grew into a roar of gossip. Libelous pamphlets, the infamous libelle, began to circulate in Paris, accusing the queen of extravagance, frivolity, and, most damningly, adultery with the handsome Swede. Fersen's impeccable discretion was his only shield. He never boasted of the queen's favor, never betrayed a confidence, and always conducted himself with perfect propriety. Yet, the emotional intensity between them was undeniable to those in their inner circle. The Comte de Saint-Priest, a diplomat at the time, later wrote in his memoirs, "I must say that the sentiment which she had for M. de Fersen was of a marked character. The queen's preference was plain to see. I have seen signs of it, which were unmistakable." While this grand, impossible romance was taking center stage in his life, the other, more private current of Fersen's being continued to flow beneath the surface. His journals and letters from this period, while dominated by his feelings for the queen, also contained the familiar, subtle observations of the world around him. He noted the handsome bearing of his fellow officers in the Royal Suédois, the classical beauty of a young courtier, or the martial grace of the king's guards. This was not a betrayal of his love for Marie Antoinette, but rather a testament to the complexity of his own nature. He loved beauty, both masculine and feminine. In the rigid binary world of the 18th century, that had no name, only a performance in public and a forbidden truth in private. Fersen was living both, a master of self-control, navigating his dual affections in a world that could only comprehend one. By 1780, the situation at Versailles had become almost untenable. The gossip was relentless, and Fersen knew that his constant presence at the queen's side was providing ammunition for her enemies. Furthermore, as a man of action and ambition, he yearned for military glory, a chance to prove his worth on the battlefield, not just in the salons of Versailles. An opportunity arose that offered a perfect, honorable escape. France was sending an expeditionary force to America to aid the colonists in their war for independence against Great Britain. Securing a position as an aide-de-camp to the commander of the French forces, the Comte de Rochambeau, was a prestigious appointment. For Fersen, the decision to go was a painful but necessary one. It was a chance to earn military distinction, to silence the gossips, and to put a noble distance between himself and the queen he loved so desperately. It was an act of sacrifice, a demonstration of his devotion. By leaving, he could better protect her reputation. His departure was a somber affair, marked by a private, emotional farewell with Marie Antoinette, who gifted him with tokens and assurances of her unwavering affection. As he prepared to set sail for the New World, Fersen was a man standing on the cusp of a new chapter, leaving behind the greatest love of his life to prove his honor in a revolutionary war, unknowingly heading towards a land of freedom that would not only test his courage but also provide a new and perhaps less guarded landscape for the complexities of his own heart. The journey across the Atlantic in the late 18th century was a formidable undertaking. It was a world of its own, a floating microcosm of society suspended for weeks, sometimes months, between continents. For Axel von Fersen, embarking in the spring of 1780 with the French Expeditionary Force, under the command of General Jean-Baptiste de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, this voyage was more than just a military deployment. It was a profound and painful transition. He was leaving behind not only his homeland and the continent he knew, but also the woman who had become the sun in his personal firmament, Queen Marie Antoinette. His heart was a tempest of conflicting emotions, the gnawing ache of separation, the ambitious thrill of impending battle, and the solemn weight of the sacrifice he was making to protect her honor. Life aboard a military transport was a stark contrast to the perfumed salons of Versailles. The cramped quarters, the monotonous diet of salted meat and hardtack, and the constant rolling motion of the sea were a harsh reality. Yet it was also a world of intense masculine camaraderie. Fersen was surrounded by the cream of the young French aristocracy, all of them, like him, eager to win glory in this revolutionary new cause. Men like the Duc de Lauzun, the Prince de Broglie, and the Vicomte de Noailles were his daily companions. They spent their days drilling, studying maps, discussing military strategy, and poring over the political philosophies that fueled this war for liberty. A war that, in a bitter irony, would later inspire the very revolution that would destroy their own world. Fersen, with his quiet dignity and proven competence, quickly earned the respect of both his peers and his superiors. Rochambeau, a seasoned and pragmatic general, recognized the young Swede's intelligence and appointed him as one of his aides de camp. This was a position of great trust and responsibility, placing Fersen at the very center of the French command structure. He was tasked with translating orders, drafting correspondence, and acting as a liaison between the French High Command and their American allies. His fluency in multiple languages and his innate diplomatic grace made him perfectly suited for the role. During the long weeks at sea, Fersen's primary solace was his journal. It became his confidant, the silent recipient of his innermost thoughts. His entries from this period are a poignant blend of military observation and personal anguish. He meticulously recorded wind conditions, naval maneuvers, and the health of the troops, but woven between these professional notations are passages of raw, heartbroken emotion. He wrote in code, using invisible ink or a numerical cipher when speaking of the Queen, referring to her by the code name Josephine, or simply Elle, she. "My heart is torn by the most cruel torments," he wrote in one entry. "To leave what I love perhaps forever, all my being is devoted to her and to her alone." These secret missives were his lifeline, a way to maintain his connection to her across the vast, unforgiving ocean. Yet this period of intense male bonding, far from the watchful eyes of any European court, also provided a different kind of emotional landscape for Fersen to navigate. In the close quarters of the ship and later, in the shared tents of military encampments, the rigid social barriers of Versailles were partially lowered. Intimate friendships were forged in the crucible of shared hardship and common purpose. It is within his descriptions of these friendships that we find further subtle evidence of his complex nature. He wrote with great admiration and affection for several of his fellow officers, most notably the young and dashing American officer John Lawrence, and his Swedish friend and confidant, Count Kurt von Stedink, who was also serving with the French forces. His descriptions of these men often went beyond simple admiration for their soldierly qualities. He noted their physical grace, their intellectual vivacity, their charm. For instance, his praise for Lawrence, a fervent abolitionist and one of George Washington's most trusted aides, was effusive, highlighting not just his bravery but his noble and appealing character. These were not necessarily expressions of a consuming passion akin to his love for Marie Antoinette, but they reveal a man deeply attuned to and appreciative of masculine beauty and virtue. In an environment stripped of the female companionship he was accustomed to, his aesthetic and emotional sensibilities found new subjects. This wasn't a betrayal or a contradiction. It was simply the other side of his soul, the part that had learned to exist in silence, expressing itself in the coded language of intense friendship and aesthetic appreciation. In July 1780, after a grueling 11-week voyage, the French fleet arrived in Newport, Rhode Island. The sight of the New World must have been both exhilarating and strange. This was not the ancient, layered landscape of Europe, but a raw, untamed continent, a society in the throes of forging a new identity. The French troops, with their immaculate white uniforms and aristocratic officers, were a spectacle for the Americans, who were accustomed to the rough-hewn appearance of their own continental army. The initial meeting between the two allies was fraught with cultural misunderstandings. The Americans were wary of these Catholic monarchists, while the French were somewhat taken aback by the rustic simplicity and democratic fervor of their new partners. Fersen, as Rochambeau's aide, was immediately thrust into the heart of the diplomatic efforts to bridge this gap. He worked closely with General George Washington, a man for whom he developed a profound and lasting admiration. Fersen saw in Washington the embodiment of the classical ideal of the citizen soldier, stoic, virtuous, and utterly dedicated to his cause. His handsome and majestic, while at the same time gentle and honest face, Fersen wrote, is a perfect reflection of his moral qualities. His role required him to travel frequently between the French and American headquarters, a difficult task in a country with poor roads and the constant threat of British patrols. The first year of the French presence in America was one of frustrating inaction. The British Royal Navy blockaded the French fleet in Newport, and the Allied armies were largely confined to a strategic standoff. This period of waiting was a test of morale and discipline. Fersen spent his time honing his military skills, studying the terrain, and improving his English. He also observed American society with a keen and sometimes critical eye. He was impressed by the spirit of liberty, but was often bemused by the lack of social hierarchy and what he perceived as a certain provincialism. "There is a great deal of comfort here, but no luxury," he noted in his journal, a telling observation from a man accustomed to the splendors of Versailles. During this time, his correspondence with Marie Antoinette continued, though letters were infrequent and took months to cross the Atlantic. Each arrival was a moment of intense emotion, a precious link to the world he had left behind. Her letters were filled with anxiety for his safety and declarations of her affection. "I can tell you that I love you," she wrote in one coded message, "and have only time for this." Fersen, in turn, reassured her of his devotion, though he often despaired at their separation. "My only fear is that you will forget me," he confessed in one letter. While his heart remained tethered to the Queen, his life in America continued to foster deep bonds with his male comrades. He formed a particularly close friendship with a fellow aide-de-camp, the young Marquis de Damas. They shared a tent, worked together daily, and confided in one another. Fersen's journals speak of Damas with a warmth and intimacy that suggest a profound emotional connection. This kind of intense sentimental friendship between men was not uncommon in the 18th century, an era that celebrated romantic brotherly love. However, for Fersen, these relationships seem to have held a particular significance, offering a form of companionship that was both emotionally fulfilling and, crucially, socially acceptable. It was a safe harbor for the affections he could not express elsewhere. He was living a life of compartments. His grand, secret love for the Queen was locked in one, his professional ambition in another, and these deep, intimate male friendships in a third. It was a complex and exhausting emotional balancing act. The military stalemate was finally broken in the summer of 1781. In a brilliant and daring strategic move, Washington and Rochambeau decided to march their combined armies over 400 miles south to Virginia to trap the British Army under General Cornwallis at Yorktown. This was the moment Fersen and his comrades had been waiting for. The march itself was a logistical masterpiece, a grueling trek through the heat and humidity of an American summer. Fersen was in his element, working tirelessly to coordinate the movement of thousands of troops, translate orders, and ensure the supply lines remained intact. The siege of Yorktown, which began in late September 1781, was the decisive battle of the American Revolution. For nearly 3 weeks, the Allied French and American forces besieged the British fortifications. Fersen was in the thick of the action, often carrying messages under enemy fire. He witnessed firsthand the horrors of battle, the roar of the cannons, the cries of the wounded, the relentless tension of the siege lines. He distinguished himself with his coolness under pressure and his unwavering bravery, earning the praise of his superiors. He was present at the storming of Redoubt No. 9 by French troops, a key moment in the battle. The climax came on October 19, 1781, when General Cornwallis, his position untenable, formally surrendered. Fersen was an eyewitness to this historic moment, watching as the defeated British Army marched out between the ranks of the victorious French and Americans. It was a moment of immense triumph, the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. For his distinguished service during the campaign, Fersen was awarded the Order of Cincinnatus by the Americans, and later the French Order of Military Merit. He had achieved the military glory he had sought. In the aftermath of Yorktown, Fersen remained in America for over a year as the slow process of peace negotiations unfolded. This period allowed him to travel more extensively, visiting Philadelphia, the bustling heart of the new nation, and interacting with members of the Continental Congress. He was a celebrated figure, the handsome and heroic Swedish count who had fought for American liberty. He was a guest in the finest homes, admired for his European Polish and his wartime exploits. Yet, despite the victory and the accolades, a profound melancholy often settled over him. His love for Marie Antoinette was an unceasing ache, a constant presence beneath the surface of his daily life. His time in America, a land founded on principles of freedom and the pursuit of happiness, only served to highlight the impossible nature of his own desires. He was free in a way he could never be in Europe, yet he was bound by a love that could never be openly acknowledged. He saw a society creating itself anew, casting off the old traditions, and perhaps he wondered if there could ever be a world where his own complex heart could find a place of open and honest acceptance. As he prepared to finally leave America in the spring of 1783, he was a changed man. He had left France as a courtier, playing the part of a soldier. He was returning as a decorated war hero. He had witnessed the birth of a republic and proven his courage under fire. He had also spent 3 years immersed in a world of intense male camaraderie, an experience that had undoubtedly deepened his understanding of his own nature. The American War was a crucible that had forged his military reputation, but it had also solidified the internal divisions of his life. He was returning to Versailles to reclaim his place by the Queen's side, more devoted than ever, but also more keenly aware of the secrets he carried and the impossible duality of the life he was destined to lead. The New World had given him glory, but it had offered no simple answers to the old longings of his heart. When Count Axel von Fersen returned to France in the summer of 1783, he was no longer the same man who had left its shores 3 years prior. He had departed as a handsome, charming, but relatively untested courtier, his reputation largely defined by the whispers that linked his name to the Queen. He returned a hero. The dust of the American battlefield still seemed to cling to him, not as grime, but as a mantle of glory. He was a decorated veteran of a victorious war, a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Washington and Rochambeau at the birth of a new nation. He carried the Order of Cincinnatus, a prestigious honor awarded by his American comrades, a symbol of his commitment to the ideals of liberty and valor. This newfound status transformed him. At the French court, where military prowess was still the ultimate measure of aristocratic masculinity, Fersen was now a figure of immense respect and admiration. He was no longer just the Queen's favorite. He was a proven man of action, his honor and courage beyond reproach. His reunion with Marie Antoinette was a moment of profound, almost unbearable, emotional intensity. It did not take place in the public glare of the Hall of Mirrors, but in the secluded private world she had created for herself, away from the prying eyes of the court. We can imagine the scene in the gardens of the Petit Trianon, or within one of its exquisitely decorated chambers. The nervous anticipation, the years of pent-up longing, the unspoken volumes that passed between them in a single glance. The 4 years of separation had been a crucible for their love. Distance and danger had not diminished it. They had refined it, deepened it, transformed it from a passionate infatuation into an unbreakable bond. For Marie Antoinette, Fersen's return was like the return of sunlight after a long, bleak winter. In his absence, her life at court had become increasingly difficult. Her initial popularity had soured, and she was the target of a relentless and vicious campaign of slander. The libelles, scurrilous pamphlets printed by anonymous authors, depicted her as a spendthrift, a degenerate, an Austrian spy, l'Autrichienne, and an adulteress. She was politically isolated, misunderstood by the king, and surrounded by a nobility she could not trust. Fersen was her anchor in this storm-tossed sea. He was the one person she felt she could be her true self with, the one man who loved her for the woman she was, not the queen she was forced to be. His unwavering loyalty, proven by his discreet departure, and now his triumphant return, was her greatest comfort. The period from 1783 to the eve of the Revolution in 1789 marked the zenith of their relationship. Fersen now moved with a new confidence and a new purpose, to provide himself with a legitimate and permanent reason for staying in France, and with the Queen's discreet support, he undertook a significant financial and career move. In 1783, he purchased the proprietorship of a French infantry regiment, the Royal Suédois. This was a hugely expensive undertaking, costing him 100,000 livres, but it was a masterstroke. It made him a colonel in the French army, giving him an official position and a command independent of court favor. He was no longer just a visitor. He was Colonel von Fersen, commander of a prestigious regiment, a servant of the French crown, while retaining his allegiance to his Swedish king. This position gave him the perfect pretext to remain close to Versailles, dividing his time between his regimental duties in the north of France and his frequent and essential visits to the court. These were their golden years, a time of stolen intimacy lived out against a backdrop of unparalleled luxury and mounting political tension. Fersen was an indispensable part of the Queen's inner circle at the Petit Trianon. Here, away from the rigid etiquette of the main palace, Marie Antoinette and her closest friends attempted to create a fantasy of pastoral life. They staged plays, enjoyed simple meals, and walked the manicured paths of the English garden. For the Queen, it was an escape. For Fersen, it was the world where their love could breathe. He was her constant companion, her escort, her confidant, and her advisor. Their letters from this period, though many were destroyed and others heavily censored by Fersen's family after his death, reveal the depth of their connection. "I love you, and will love you madly all my life," one of the few surviving uncensored fragments reads. His own journal entries, though typically reserved, betray his feelings. He meticulously records every meeting, every conversation, every moment spent in her presence. His life revolved entirely around her. He had become a master of the double life. In public, he was the model of propriety, reserved, dignified, and unfailingly respectful to both the king and queen. He was the stoic Swedish soldier, a man of few words and impeccable conduct. This carefully constructed facade was his shield, deflecting the court's endless gossip. But in private, in the seclusion of Trianon, or during clandestine meetings arranged by loyal servants, he was simply Axel, the man Marie Antoinette loved and trusted above all others. He became her constant companion, her confidant in love and politics alike. He was, as one contemporary observer noted, the Queen's prime minister in all but name. This intense focus on his relationship with the Queen did not, however, erase the other facets of his identity. His private world remained a complex tapestry. He maintained his deep, intimate friendships with his male comrades from the American War, and his journals still contained fleeting but telling observations of masculine beauty. But his central emotional energy, the core of his being, was now entirely devoted to Marie Antoinette. This singular focus was perhaps a coping mechanism. By channeling all his passion into this one grand, all-consuming love, he could keep the other, more confusing aspects of his nature at bay. His love for the Queen was so powerful, so transcendent, that it seemed to subsume everything else. Furthermore, he was under immense pressure from his family in Sweden. His father, the old field marshal, was growing impatient. Axel was his heir, the only son to carry on the Fersen name. It was his duty to marry a suitable noblewoman and produce the next generation. Letters from Sweden were filled with suggestions for advantageous matches, with descriptions of wealthy and well-connected Swedish heiresses. Fersen politely but firmly resisted every attempt at matchmaking. He made excuses. His military career demanded his full attention. He had not yet found the right woman, but the truth, known only to him and a very small circle of confidants, was that his heart was already given. He could not and would not marry another while the Queen of France held his soul in her hands. This refusal to marry was a profound act of sacrifice, a secret vow of celibacy that further cemented his unique and singular devotion to Marie Antoinette. But the gilded cage in which they lived was growing increasingly fragile. The political and social fabric of France was beginning to unravel. The state's finances were in a catastrophic state, and public anger was mounting against the perceived extravagance of the court, with the Queen as its primary target. In 1785, a scandal erupted that would irrevocably destroy what was left of her reputation, the affair of the diamond necklace. It was a complex and sordid tale of ambition, deceit, and staggering gullibility, involving a fabulously expensive diamond necklace, a social climbing adventuress named Jeanne de la Motte, and the deeply misguided Cardinal de Rohan, who was desperate to win the Queen's favor. In short, Jeanne de la Motte tricked the cardinal into believing that the Queen wished to secretly purchase the necklace, using him as an intermediary. She forged the Queen's signature on a contract and even arranged a nighttime meeting in the gardens of Versailles between the cardinal and a prostitute impersonating Marie Antoinette. The cardinal, completely duped, acquired the necklace on credit from the royal jewelers and gave it to Jeanne, who promptly had it broken up and sold off on the black market in London. When the jewelers, unpaid, went to the Queen for their money, the entire sordid plot unraveled. Marie Antoinette was completely innocent. She had no knowledge of the scheme and had, in fact, previously refused to buy the necklace, deeming it too extravagant. Yet when the scandal broke, the public refused to believe her. Her reputation was already so tarnished that it seemed plausible to them that she was capable of such decadent and deceitful behavior. The ensuing public trial of the Cardinal de Rohan became a trial of the Queen herself. Though the cardinal was ultimately acquitted, to the public's delight, the affair was a public relations disaster from which the monarchy, and Marie Antoinette in particular, would never recover. It solidified her image as Madame Deficit, the frivolous, deceptive foreigner who was bankrupting France. Throughout this agonizing ordeal, Fersen stood by her, loyal, unshaken, even as she was turned into a monster in the public eye. This experience hardened him, deepening his distrust of the masses and his contempt for the political factions that were using the Queen as a scapegoat. The affair was a brutal lesson in the power of perception over truth, and it created an unbridgeable chasm between the court and the people of France. The years following the necklace affair were filled with a growing sense of dread. The financial crisis worsened, attempts at reform failed, and the political temperature continued to rise. Fersen's role subtly shifted. He was no longer just a lover and confidant. He was a political advisor trying to help the king and queen navigate the treacherous political waters. His perspective as an outsider, a Swedish aristocrat loyal to an enlightened but absolute monarch, shaped his advice. He urged strength and firmness, believing that any concession to the growing demands for popular sovereignty would be a fatal weakness. By 1788, the situation had reached a breaking point. Facing bankruptcy, King Louis XVI made the fateful decision to convene the Estates General, a medieval representative assembly that had not met in 175 years. It was a desperate gamble to solve the financial crisis, but it would ultimately unleash the forces of revolution. The air at Versailles was thick with foreboding. The glittering parties and elaborate ceremonies continued, but they had taken on a frantic, almost hysterical quality. It was the last dazzling flicker of a candle before it was extinguished forever. For Axel von Fersen and Marie Antoinette, their private world was about to be violently consumed by history. The stolen moments in the gardens of Trianon, the whispered conversations, the secret letters, all the fragile components of their impossible love were now threatened by the roar of an approaching revolution. The gilded cage was about to be broken open, not by an act of liberation, but by a tidal wave of popular fury that would sweep them all away. The storm they had long seen gathering on the horizon had finally arrived, and Axel von Fersen, the loyal Swedish count, would have to choose between his duty as a soldier and his devotion to the woman he loved, a choice that would lead him down a path of incredible heroism an ultimate tragedy. The spring of 1789 was the season the Old World died. The convening of the Estates General on May 5th was, on the surface, a grand and solemn affair, a revival of ancient tradition meant to solve a modern crisis. Representatives from the three orders of French society, the clergy, the nobility, and the vastly larger Third Estate, converged on Versailles, bringing with them the hopes and grievances of a nation on the brink. For Axel von Fersen, observing these proceedings from his privileged position at court, the entire spectacle was deeply unsettling. As a Swedish aristocrat, his political instincts were fundamentally monarchist. He believed in a strong, centralized authority, in social hierarchy, and in the divine order that placed the king at the apex of the nation. He viewed the demands of the Third Estate not as a legitimate call for reform, but as a dangerous challenge to the very foundations of civilization, an unleashing of chaotic forces that could only lead to ruin. He watched with growing alarm as the political situation rapidly escalated beyond the king's control. The Third Estate, feeling stonewalled by the privileged orders, took a revolutionary step on June 17th by declaring itself the National Assembly, the true representative body of the French people. 3 days later, finding themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, they gathered in the royal tennis court and swore the famous tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had given France a constitution. For Fersen and the Queen's inner circle, this was an act of open rebellion. Fersen was frustrated, almost to the point of despair, by what he saw as King Louis XVI's fatal indecisiveness. Where the situation demanded a firm, decisive show of force to restore royal authority, the king dithered, offered concessions, and seemed incapable of grasping the existential threat he faced. Fersen urged Marie Antoinette to encourage a stronger stance, but the king, a fundamentally gentle and non-confrontational man, recoiled from the prospect of shedding his subjects' blood. The simmering tension finally exploded on the 14th of July, 1789. The storming of the Bastille, a medieval fortress and prison in the heart of Paris that symbolized royal tyranny, was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through Versailles and across the world. The news arrived at the palace as a confused torrent of rumors, then as horrifying, undeniable fact. The governor of the prison had been murdered. His head paraded through the streets on a pike. The city of Paris was in the hands of the mob. The revolution was no longer a matter of pamphlets and political debates. It was a violent, visceral reality. For Fersen, this was the confirmation of his darkest fears. The chaos he had predicted had been unleashed. In the frantic, terrified atmosphere that gripped Versailles in the days that followed, he became an island of calm and resolve. While many nobles, including the king's own brother, began to pack their bags and flee the country, becoming the first of the émigrés, Fersen stood his ground. His duty, his love, his entire sense of honor bound him to the queen's side. He became her protector, her shadow, advising her, comforting her, and providing the steady, unwavering support that her husband seemed unable to offer. His contempt for the revolutionary mob was matched only by his growing conviction that the royal family's only hope lay in a forceful counter-revolution, supported by the other monarchs of Europe. The summer of 1789 saw the revolution spread like wildfire. The great fear swept through the countryside as peasants, terrified by rumors of aristocratic plots, rose up and burned the chateau of their lords. On the night of August 4th, in a desperate attempt to quell the unrest, the National Assembly formally abolished the feudal privileges of the nobility, dismantling the legal and social structure of the Ancien Regime in a single stroke. Then, on August 26th, They issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that proclaimed the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, effectively ending the concept of absolute monarchy. The world that Axel von Fersen had known, the world of hierarchy and divine right, was being systematically torn down, stone by stone. The final fatal blow to the royal family's gilded isolation came in the autumn. On October 5th, a massive crowd, led by the formidable market women of Paris, the Poissardes, marched the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles. They were hungry, angry about bread shortages, and inflamed by radical rhetoric. They demanded that the king and his family return with them to Paris, to be under the watchful eye of the people. The day descended into a nightmare of violence. The mob breached the palace gates, killing several of the royal bodyguards. A frantic and bloodthirsty group surged towards the queen's apartments, their cries of, "We want the Austrian's head," echoing through the marble halls. Marie Antoinette barely escaped, fleeing through a secret passage to the king's chambers, just moments before the mob smashed down her bedroom door and tore her bed to pieces with their pikes and bayonets. Fersen was in the palace during this terrifying ordeal, a helpless witness to the violent humiliation of the monarchy. The following day, the royal family was forced to submit. To a roar from the massive crowd gathered in the central courtyard, they appeared on the balcony. Finally, they descended and boarded a carriage for the slow, agonizing journey to Paris, surrounded by the mob, which now carried the severed heads of their guards on pikes as gruesome trophies. It was a funeral procession for the French monarchy. Axel von Fersen watched them go, his heart filled with a potent mixture of rage, grief, and a burning, all-consuming resolve. The queen was now a prisoner. From that moment on, his life would have only one purpose: to save her. The royal family was installed in the Tuileries Palace in the center of Paris. It was a sprawling, gloomy building that had not been a primary royal residence for a century. Though they were surrounded by the trappings of royalty, they were prisoners in all but name, their every move watched by National Guardsmen, their freedom of movement severely restricted. The contrast with the sprawling private world of Versailles and the Trianon could not have been more stark. They were trapped in the heart of the revolution, hostages to its unpredictable whims. This new reality forced a fundamental shift in Fersen's role. He could no longer be the discreet courtier or the constant companion. To remain close to the queen now required stealth, secrecy, and subterfuge. He became, in essence, a secret agent, the chief operative in the service of a captive monarchy. His life went underground, a clandestine existence of secret messages, back-alley meetings, and elaborate disguises. He was no longer just the queen's lover. He was her spy master, her lifeline to the outside world, and her only hope for escape. His first priority was to establish a secure line of communication. He developed a complex system of codes and ciphers, often using invisible ink made from lemon juice, to correspond with Marie Antoinette. Trusted couriers, men like the Swedish Baron de Goguelat or the loyal Russian Baroness de Korff, risked their lives to smuggle these letters in and out of the heavily guarded Tuileries. These letters are among the most poignant documents of the entire revolutionary period. They are a desperate, heartbreaking mix of political strategy, intelligence reports, and deeply personal declarations of love and despair. "I live and exist only to serve you," Fersen wrote to her. She in turn placed her absolute faith in him. "Be assured that I am yours. My God, how cruel it is to be so near and not be able to see each other." Their correspondence became the nerve center of the counter-revolution, a secret thread of resistance woven in the very heart of enemy territory. Fersen also activated his extensive network of contacts across Europe. He wrote ceaselessly to his father in Sweden, to King Gustav III, and to sympathetic aristocrats and monarchs in Spain, Austria, and Prussia. He pleaded, cajoled, and strategized, trying to build a coalition of foreign powers that would intervene militarily to crush the revolution and restore the French monarchy. He became the royal family's unofficial foreign minister, their eyes and ears on the continent. This work was dangerous and exhausting, requiring constant vigilance and a steely nerve. His actions were driven by a powerful duality. On one hand, a deep-seated political conviction in the cause of monarchism. On the other, a profound and desperate love for a woman in mortal danger. He was the knight of the lost cause, fueled by both ideology and devotion. By the latter half of 1790, it was becoming clear that the political situation was irreversible, and that the royal family's danger was growing more acute with each passing month. The king had been forced to accept the civil constitution of the clergy, a measure that placed the Catholic Church under state control and alienated a huge portion of the population. Radical factions in Paris, like the Jacobins, were growing in power, and their rhetoric was becoming increasingly anti-monarchical. The idea of an escape, once a distant and desperate thought, now began to crystallize into a concrete plan. It was an immense gamble, but it was fast becoming their only one. The king, ever hesitant, was plagued by indecision. He was a devout man who felt that leaving his kingdom would be an act of abdication and a betrayal of his people. Marie Antoinette, however, was far more pragmatic and resolute. She saw the escape as their only path to survival, and she knew there was only one man she could trust to orchestrate it, Axel von Fersen. Fersen threw himself into the planning with a meticulous, almost obsessive energy. This was to be the master stroke of his life, the ultimate expression of his love and loyalty. No detail was too small, no precaution too extreme. He took personal command of every aspect of the operation, which would become known to history as the flight to Varennes. First, the destination, the royalist stronghold of Montmédy, a fortified town in northeastern France, close to the border of the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. There, they would be under the protection of loyal troops commanded by the Marquis de Bouillé, and from this position of strength, they could either negotiate with the Assembly or await foreign intervention. Next, the transport. This would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Instead of using two small, fast, and inconspicuous carriages, the king insisted that the entire family, including the children and their governess, travel together. To accommodate them, Fersen commissioned the construction of a large, heavy, and luxurious coach known as a berline. It was comfortable and well-equipped, but it was also slow, cumbersome, and painted a conspicuous bright green and yellow. It was a royal coach in all but its crests. Then the disguises and identity. They would travel under the guise of a Russian noblewoman, the Baroness de Korff, and her entourage. Marie Antoinette would play the role of the governess, Madame Rocher. The king, in a supreme irony, would be disguised as her valet, Monsieur Durand. The children would be the Baroness's daughters. Fersen himself secured the false passport in the name of the real Baroness de Korff, who had already left the country. Finally, the logistics. This was Fersen's domain. He poured his own immense fortune into the venture, financing the construction of the berline and arranging for the necessary funds for the journey. He personally charted the route, a 200-mile journey to the east. He arranged for loyal army detachments to be stationed at key points along the way to act as escorts, though their presence, it was feared, might also attract unwanted attention. He organized relays of fresh horses to be waiting at staging posts to avoid the delays of using the public post houses. Fersen himself would play the most dangerous role of all. He would personally oversee the family's departure from Paris. Disguised as a coachman, he planned to drive the first stage of the journey himself, ensuring they made it safely out of the city's web of patrols and checkpoints. The risks were astronomical. Discovery would mean certain death for him and likely for the royal family as well. It was an operation that required perfect timing, flawless execution, and an incredible amount of luck. As the final preparations were made in the late spring of 1791, the fate of the French monarchy and the life of the woman he loved rested entirely in Axel von Fersen's hands. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and fateful gambles in history. The night of June 20th, 1791, was the fulcrum upon which the fate of the French monarchy would turn. For months, Axel von Fersen had lived and breathed this plan, every detail memorized, every contingency considered. His mind was a complex map of routes, timetables, and secret arrangements. His entire fortune, his reputation, and most importantly, the lives of the royal family were staked on the events of this single night. For him, this was not a political maneuver. It was the ultimate act of chivalric devotion, the desperate rescue of his queen from the clutches of her enemies. He was calm, his nerves forged into steel by years of military discipline and the immense self-control he had cultivated throughout his life. But beneath that placid surface was a current of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Everything had to be perfect. The Tuileries Palace was a formidable prison. Heavily guarded by the National Guard, many of whom were sympathetic to the revolution, its every entrance and exit was monitored. The escape was timed to coincide with a shift change in the Guard, a moment of potential confusion. The plan was a masterpiece of audacity and precision, relying on split-second timing and the flawless performance of its actors. One by one, under the cover of darkness, the royal fugitives were to slip out of the palace through unguarded or lesser-used doors and make their way to a rendezvous point on the Rue de l'Echelle, a small street nearby. First came the royal children, Prince Louis Charles and Princess Marie-Thérèse, accompanied by their governess, the Marquise de Tourzel. Disguised as the children of the fictitious Baroness de Korff, they were led out of the palace by a trusted servant. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant shout a potential alarm. They made it to the rendezvous point, a dark corner where a simple, unremarkable fiacre, a common city cab, was waiting. At the reins, disguised in the drab, heavy coat of a Parisian coachman, was Axel von Fersen. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, his aristocratic bearing concealed by a deliberate slouch. To any casual observer, he was just another cabbie waiting for a fare. Next came Madame Elisabeth, the king's devout and gentle sister, disguised as a nursemaid. She too slipped through the net of surveillance and joined the small, anxious group in the waiting carriage. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The most dangerous parts were yet to come. King Louis XVI was the next to emerge. Disguised as the Baroness's valet, Monsieur Durand, he wore a simple brown coat and a round hat. The king, a man whose every move had been a public spectacle since birth, found himself scurrying through the dark corridors of his own palace, a ghost in his own home. He managed to exit without incident, his large recognizable features hopefully obscured by the poor light. The final and most perilous escape was the Queen's. Marie Antoinette, disguised as the governess Madame Rocher, was to be the last to leave. She was escorted by one of the royal bodyguards. In a heart-stopping moment of confusion, She took a wrong turn in the labyrinthine streets of the Carousel district. For several agonizing minutes she was lost, wandering in the darkness just a stone's throw from the palace, her heart pounding with every footstep. At one point, she came face to face with the carriage of the Marquis de Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, his torch-bearing entourage illuminating the night. She instinctively hid herself in the shadows of an arcade, pressing herself against the cold stone until the danger passed. Finally, she found her way to the waiting carriage. As she climbed inside, Fersen, without a word, took the reins. The royal family of France, minus one of the king's brothers who was escaping via a separate route, was now crammed into a single, humble cab, their fate in the hands of their Swedish knight. Fersen clicked the reins, and the horses moved off. The first stage of the journey was the most dangerous, navigating the streets of Paris itself. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, each sound amplified in the tense silence. Fersen drove with a steady hand, affecting the nonchalant air of a man finishing his night's work. His mind, however, was racing. He had to steer them through the city to the Saint-Martin barrier, a customs gate on the northeastern edge of Paris, where the large, specially built berlin was waiting. Every patrol they passed was a potential disaster, every questioning glance from a sentry a moment of pure terror. But his disguise and the sheer audacity of the plan held. No one thought to look for the King of France masquerading as a valet in a common cab. They reached the barrier shortly after midnight. There, waiting in the shadows, was the berlin, a dark, hulking shape that represented both their hope for freedom and, ultimately, a fatal misjudgment. The transfer was made quickly. The royal family scrambled from the cramped fiacre into the spacious, well-appointed interior of the new coach. Their journey could now begin in earnest. Fersen climbed onto the driver's box of the berlin, taking the reins for this crucial first leg of the journey out of the city's immediate orbit. He drove the heavy coach with a focused intensity, pushing the horses, making up for the precious time lost during the Queen's detour. They reached the town of Bondy, about 10 miles northeast of Paris, just as the first hints of dawn were threatening to break the darkness. Here, a fresh team of horses was waiting, as was a carriage for Fersen himself. This was the moment he had been dreading, the planned and necessary point of his departure. His role was finished. He had gotten them out of the city, away from the immediate danger. His instructions were to take a different route north towards Brussels, to create a diversion, and to arrange for support from the Austrian side of the border once the family was safe. To continue with them would only increase the risk of recognition for the whole party. This farewell, on a dark road in the French countryside, was the last time Axel von Fersen would ever see Marie Antoinette. History does not record their final words, but one can imagine the scene, thick with unspoken emotion. There could be no lingering goodbye, no tearful embrace. Every second counted. It would have been a hurried exchange of reassurances, a final desperate look that conveyed a lifetime of love and fear, a whispered promise of reunion in a safer, happier future that would never come. As the berlin pulled away, carrying the Queen and her family towards a freedom they would never reach, Fersen stood for a moment, watching it disappear into the pre-dawn gloom. Then he climbed into his own waiting carriage and spurred his horses north, his own heart a hollow ache of hope and terror. The royal family's journey, now under the command of a team of royal bodyguards traveling with them, almost immediately began to unravel. Fersen's meticulous plan was a delicate clockwork mechanism, and the first grain of sand had already entered the gears. They were nearly 2 hours behind schedule. This delay would prove catastrophic. The berline itself was a problem. It was heavy and slow, and the king, unaccustomed to such journeys and perhaps feeling a premature sense of relief, insisted on getting out to walk up steep hills to stretch his legs, further slowing their progress. This casual pace betrayed a fatal lack of urgency. They were behaving less like fugitives and more like royalty on a country excursion. The first scheduled rendezvous with a military escort, a detachment of dragoons under the Duc de Choiseul, was at Pont de Somvesle. When the royal coach failed to arrive at the appointed time, Choiseul, nervous about arousing local suspicion with his waiting troops, made a fateful decision. Assuming the plan had been cancelled or had failed back in Paris, he withdrew his men and sent a message up the line that the Berlin was not coming. This set off a chain reaction. At the next town, Saint-Menehould, the waiting dragoons, having received Choiseul's message, also began to disperse, mingling with the locals in the town's taverns. It was in Saint-Menehould that the fragile illusion of their disguises was shattered. The arrival of the large, luxurious coach and the waiting troops had already made the townspeople suspicious. As the Berlin waited for a fresh team of horses, the king, fatally incautious, put his head out of the window. The local postmaster, a fervent revolutionary named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, was a former soldier with a sharp eye. He noticed a striking resemblance between the valet and the portrait of the king on an assignat, the paper currency of the revolution. His suspicions were confirmed when he compared the face on the coin to the man in the carriage. While the Berlin lumbered on towards the next town, Varennes-en-Argonne, Drouet took action. Convinced he had uncovered a plot to smuggle the king out of the country, he and a friend mounted their horses and galloped off on a shortcut through the woods, determined to intercept the fugitives. It was now a desperate race against time. The royal family arrived in Varennes late in the evening, well after 11 p.m. They were exhausted, terrified, and now completely off schedule. Here, their final piece of bad luck struck. The relay of fresh horses, which was supposed to be waiting for them on the near side of the town's bridge, was not there. The inexperienced young officer in charge had, for reasons that remain unclear, moved them to the far side of town after the bridge. The Berlin stopped. The bodyguards searched in the darkness, unable to find the fresh horses. All was confusion and mounting panic. Those few moments of delay were all Drouet needed. He and his companion galloped into Varennes just after the Berlin had arrived, shouting the alarm, "The king is escaping, stop him!" They, along with the local procureur, a man named Sauce, quickly roused the town. The local National Guard was called out. They overturned a furniture cart on the narrow bridge over the river Aire, blocking the only escape route. The tocsin, the town's alarm bell, began to ring, its frantic peal echoing through the night, a death knell for the monarchy. The Berlin was surrounded. The king and queen tried to bluff their way through, insisting they were merely the entourage of the Baroness de Korff. But it was no use. They were forced to disembark and were escorted to the home of the procureur Sauce, which was also a grocery shop. There, in the humble candlelit room above the shop, the final humiliating confrontation took place. A local judge who had seen the king at Versailles was brought in. He fell to his knees before Louis, and the charade was over. The king, with a weary resignation, finally admitted his identity. "Yes, I am your king." The escape had failed. They were just 30 miles from the safety of Montmédy, a few hours' ride from freedom. But Fersen's brilliant, intricate plan, a plan that had succeeded against all odds in its most dangerous phase in Paris, had been undone on the open road by a series of small, mundane errors, missed connections, and a single fatal moment of recognition. News of the king's capture spread like wildfire. The family spent a sleepless, terrifying night in Varennes as thousands of National Guardsmen and angry citizens flocked to the town. The next morning, under heavy guard, They began the slow, humiliating journey back to Paris. This was no longer a flight to freedom, but a captive procession. They were paraded back to their capital city, not as monarchs, but as traitors. The crowds that lined the roads were no longer cheering, but silent and menacing. For Fersen, who learned of the catastrophic failure a few days later in Brussels, the news was a blow from which he would never emotionally recover. His meticulously planned rescue had turned into a disaster, delivering the woman he loved not to safety, but back into the hands of a revolution that was now baying for blood. The longest night was over, but an even darker day was about to dawn. The news, when it finally reached him, was not a single clean blow, but a slow, agonizing poison that seeped into his soul. For days after his own escape from France, Fersen had existed in a state of suspended animation, a torment of waiting and not knowing. He haunted the post houses, his heart leaping at the sight of every approaching courier, his stomach clenching with dread. He replayed the escape in his mind 1,000 times, searching for an error, a miscalculation, a single detail he might have overlooked. But the Parisian phase, the most perilous part, had been a success. He had delivered them from the lion's den. Surely they were safe. The confirmation of their capture at Varennes shattered his world. The dispatch, cold and official, detailed the humiliating truth. The delays, the missed rendezvous, the fatal recognition, the capture. For Fersen, a man defined by his meticulous planning and unwavering self-control, the failure was a personal and catastrophic wound. It wasn't just that the plan had failed, he had failed. He had promised to deliver his queen to safety, and instead he had delivered her back to her captors, her position now infinitely more perilous than before. Guilt, raw and corrosive, consumed him. "All is lost, my dear friend," he wrote to his confidant Evert Taube in a letter trembling with anguish, "and I am in a despair that will end only with my life." This despair, however, did not paralyze him. It transformed, hardening into a white-hot, obsessive resolve. If he could not save her with stealth, he would save her with fire and steel. His grief became a furious energy, a relentless diplomatic crusade to force the crowned heads of Europe to act. From his base in Brussels, which became the nerve center for the French émigré cause, Fersen became a whirlwind of activity. His life was now a ceaseless torrent of correspondence, secret meetings, and strategic planning. He was no longer just a lover. He was the self-appointed minister of a government in exile, a lone knight trying to rally a crusade to save his imprisoned queen. He wrote impassioned, often demanding letters to his own king, Gustav III of Sweden, who was one of the few European monarchs who shared his fervent desire for a military intervention. He corresponded with Catherine the Great of Russia, with the King of Spain, and, most importantly, with Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II of Austria. Fersen urged them to issue a joint ultimatum to the French National Assembly, a Congress of Kings that would threaten overwhelming military force if any harm came to the royal family. He argued, pleaded, and strategized, drafting plans for a multi-front invasion of France. But he found himself battling a wall of political inertia, caution, and self-interest. The other monarchs were wary of the revolution, but they were also wary of each other, and some even saw a strategic advantage in a weakened, chaotic France. The Emperor Leopold, in particular, was cautious to a fault, frustrating Fersen with his endless delays and diplomatic hedging. He was a man fighting a fire, screaming for help from neighbors who were content to watch it burn so long as the flames did not reach their own houses. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the consequences of the flight to Varennes were swift and devastating. The royal family's return was a spectacle of profound national humiliation for the monarchy. They were paraded through the streets of Paris in their berlin, the blinds drawn, surrounded by a sea of silent, hostile faces. By order of the assembly, no one was to cheer the king, but no one was to insult him either. The result was an eerie, menacing silence that was more terrifying than any jeer. It was the silence of a people who had withdrawn their consent to be governed, who no longer saw a king, but a traitor. The flight destroyed the last bond between king and people. He had fled, and in their eyes, betrayed them. The fiction of a king held captive by radical elements in Paris, a fiction that many constitutional monarchists had clung to, was now untenable. The king had not been abducted, he had fled. He had left behind a proclamation denouncing the revolution and all its works. It was a clear act of repudiation. In the eyes of the people, he was not just a weak king, he was a perjurer who had betrayed his oath to the new constitution. The political repercussions were immediate. The radical Jacobin and Cordelier clubs, who had long called for the abolition of the monarchy, saw their influence skyrocket. For the first time, the word republic was no longer a fringe, intellectual concept, but a mainstream political demand. The king's authority was suspended, and he and the queen were placed under even tighter guard at the Tuileries, now truly prisoners in every sense of the word. In this atmosphere of intense surveillance and mounting danger, the secret correspondence between Fersen and Marie Antoinette resumed, now more vital and more perilous than ever. Their letters from this period are heart-wrenching artifacts, testaments to a love that endured even as their world crumbled around them. They were, of necessity, primarily political documents. Marie Antoinette, with a newfound political courage born of desperation, became Fersen's most important source of intelligence from within the Tuileries. She reported on the shifting factions in the assembly, on the secret dealings of ministers, on the mood of the city. She was clear-eyed, pragmatic, and utterly reliant on Fersen's judgment. "Our only hope is in the foreign powers," she wrote, echoing his own conviction. "They alone can save us." But woven into this fabric of political strategy are threads of the deepest personal emotion. The coded language and invisible ink could not conceal the raw longing, the fear, and the profound love that bound them. "I can tell you that I love you," Marie Antoinette wrote in one of her last surviving letters to him. "Do not worry too much about me. Adieu." It was a message of love and a plea for his own well-being, a selfless thought, even as her own fate hung by a thread. Fersen, for his part, poured his entire being into his replies. "I live only for you," he assured her. "To see you once more, freely, and to be able to tell you how much I love you is the only goal to which I aspire." Their love story, once played out in the idyllic gardens of Trianon, now existed only in these fragile, secret scraps of paper, passed by loyal hands through a city that wanted them both dead. As the autumn of 1791 gave way to a grim winter, Fersen grew increasingly frantic. The new legislative assembly was more radical than its predecessor, and the political rhetoric grew more violent by the day. He became convinced that the European monarchs would not act decisively, enough or quickly enough to save the Queen. An agonizing thought began to take hold in his mind. If the kings of Europe would not act, he would have to act alone. He conceived a new plan, one even more daring and reckless than the flight to Varennes. He would go back into the lion's den himself. He would return to Paris in disguise to see the Queen one last time, to assess the situation with his own eyes, and to propose a new, simpler escape plan. It was a suicidal mission. Fersen was now one of the most hated men in France, a notorious counter-revolutionary whose effigy had been burned in the streets. If he were caught, he would be torn to pieces by the mob or sent to the guillotine without a moment's hesitation. His friends pleaded with him not to go, but his obsession, his guilt, and his desperate love drove him on. He was a man haunted by the failure at Varennes, and this was his chance, however slim, at redemption. In February 1792, using a forged passport, he slipped across the border and began the perilous journey to Paris. He traveled in disguise, his heart in his throat with every stop, his eyes scanning every face for a flicker of recognition. On February 13th, he arrived in the capital. The city was a changed place, tense and grim, the revolutionary fervor now a palpable, menacing presence on every street corner. He made his way through the darkened streets to the Tuileries Palace, using a secret route known only to a handful of loyalists. His final meeting with the king and queen is one of the most dramatic and heartbreaking episodes of the entire revolution. After evading the guards, he was smuggled into the royal apartments. The reunion, after so many months of terror and separation, must have been overwhelming. He found the king and queen aged and worn by their ordeal. Marie Antoinette, her hair having famously turned white almost overnight after the trauma of Varennes, threw herself into his arms. For a few precious hours they were together, a brief, impossible island of intimacy in a sea of hatred. Fersen laid out his new plan. It was simple, direct, and designed to avoid the mistakes of Varennes. 2 light, fast carriages, a different, less conspicuous route. It could work. He pleaded with the king to take this chance, to save himself, his wife, and his children. But he was met with a devastating, soul-crushing hesitation. King Louis XVI was a broken man. The failure at Varennes had shattered his nerve. He was now resigned to his fate, placing his trust in a misguided belief that the assembly would not dare to harm him and that his people would eventually come to their senses. He was also fatally placing his hopes on the slow, ponderous diplomatic maneuvers of the European powers. He would not attempt another escape. The risk, he argued, was too great. Fersen was aghast. He argued, he reasoned, he begged. He spent 2 hours trying to convince the king, but it was useless. Louis was paralyzed by indecision, a prisoner of his own fatalism. For Fersen, this refusal was a final, terrible blow. He had risked his life to offer them one last chance at salvation, and it had been rejected. He had come to save them, but he now realized they could not or would not be saved. He spent one last night in Paris, hidden in a safe house. The next day, February 21st, he met with the Queen, one last time, for a hurried, secret farewell before beginning his own escape from the city. As he made his way back towards the safety of the border, he was a man utterly defeated, his heart heavy with the certainty of the tragedy to come. He had looked into the eyes of the man who held the Queen's life in his hands, and had seen not a king, but a martyr, a man already walking towards the scaffold. His departure marked the point of no return. 2 months later, in April 1792, France declared war on Austria, plunging Europe into a conflict that would last for decades. The war radicalized the revolution even further. On August 10, 1792, a Parisian mob backed by revolutionary soldiers stormed the Tuileries Palace in a bloody assault. The king's Swiss guards were massacred. The royal family fled for their lives to the Legislative Assembly, seeking a protection that would not be granted. The monarchy was officially abolished. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, now stripped of their titles and known simply as Louis and Antoinette Capet, were imprisoned with their children in the grim medieval fortress known as the Temple. From Brussels, Fersen could only watch in impotent horror as the final act of the tragedy unfolded. The September massacres saw thousands of suspected counter-revolutionaries butchered in the prisons of Paris. On September 21st, the French Republic was declared. The final unthinkable step was now inevitable: the trial of the king. The world had unraveled completely. The elegant courtier who had once charmed Versailles, the brave soldier who had fought for liberty in America, was now a powerless exile, watching from afar, as the revolution he had fought so hard to stop prepared to devour the woman he loved more than life itself. The news of King Louis XVI's execution on January 21st, 1793, was not a shock to Axel von Fersen. It was the brutal, inevitable conclusion to a tragedy he had long foreseen. Yet foresight did not blunt the pain. The cold official words in the gazettes felt like a physical blow, a confirmation that the world had truly descended into madness. The king, the gentle, indecisive man Fersen had tried so desperately to save, had been led to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution and judicially murdered by his own people. Fersen's grief was cold and hard, a diamond of pure rage. He saw the king's death not just as a regicide, but as a personal failure, another grim tally in the ledger of his inability to protect the royal family. But this grief was overshadowed by a far more immediate and terrifying fear. What would become of her? With the king gone, Marie Antoinette, now known to the Republic as the Widow Capet, was left to face the full, undiluted venom of the revolution alone. She, her daughter Marie-Thérèse, her son Louis-Charles, and her sister-in-law Madame Elizabeth were still imprisoned in the grim medieval tower of the Temple. The king's execution had not sated the mob's bloodlust. It had only whetted its appetite. Fersen knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was their next target. His life, which had already been a frantic whirlwind of diplomatic activity, now became a singular, desperate obsession. All his energy, all his remaining fortune, all his will was focused on one goal: saving the Queen of France. He wrote with renewed feverish intensity to the courts of Europe, trying to shame them into action with the king's blood. He pleaded with her brother, the Emperor Francis II, who had succeeded Leopold II, to threaten massive retaliation if any harm came to his sister. He financed covert operations, funneling money to royalist agents in Paris, hoping to bribe guards or organize one last desperate jailbreak. He was a man possessed, fueled by a mixture of love, guilt, and a burning desire for vengeance. Meanwhile, in the Temple, Marie Antoinette's ordeal entered its final, most cruel phase. She was subjected to a campaign of systematic psychological torture. Her guards were brutal and uncivilized, chosen for their revolutionary zeal. They smoked, drank, and sang the revolutionary songs in her presence, their every action a calculated insult. She bore it all with a regal dignity that infuriated her captors. But the true torture was yet to come. On the night of July 3rd, 1793, commissioners from the radical Paris Commune entered her cell and announced their decree. Her son, the 8-year-old Louis-Charles, the boy who royalists now considered King Louis XVII, was to be taken from her. The scene that followed was one of primal, heartbreaking horror. Marie Antoinette physically barred the door, shielding her son with her body. For 2 hours she fought, pleaded, and reasoned with the men, her royal composure dissolving into the raw terror of a mother protecting her child. "You will have to kill me before you tear my son from my arms," she cried. In the end, they threatened to kill both her children if she did not comply. Defeated, she was forced to let him go. It was the cruelest cut of all. The boy was handed over to a brutish, semi-literate cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was instructed to re-educate the little wolf cub, to erase his royal past and turn him into a good little revolutionary. This was the last time she would ever see her son. This act of calculated cruelty was designed to break her spirit completely. A month later, on August 1st, in the dead of night, she too was removed from the temple. She was transferred to the conciergerie, the infamous prison known as the antechamber to the guillotine. It was a damp, rat-infested dungeon on the banks of the Seine. Her cell was small, dark, and constantly watched by 2 guards who were separated from her only by a simple screen. She was no longer a queen, not even a widow. She was prisoner number 280, awaiting her final, inevitable summons. Even in this darkest of hours, a few loyalists made one last, desperate attempt to save her. In what became known as the Carnation Plot, Le Complot de l'Oeil, a royalist agent, the Chevalier de Rougeville, managed to gain access to her cell and drop a carnation at her feet. Hidden inside were 2 notes, one containing a secret message and the other concealing a pin for her to reply. The plot, a hopelessly romantic and ill-conceived plan for her escape, was discovered almost immediately, and it only served to tighten the security around her and hasten her trial. Fersen, in Brussels, heard whispers of these plots, his heart torn between a desperate hope and a grim realism. He knew that the net was closing. The final act began on October 14, 1793, when Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was a sham trial, a piece of political theater whose verdict had been decided long in advance. The courtroom was packed with a hostile crowd. For 2 days she faced her accusers, led by the fanatical prosecutor Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville. She was no longer the dazzling Queen of Versailles, but a pale, prematurely aged woman of 37, dressed in a simple black mourning dress, her face etched with grief. A parade of witnesses was brought forth to testify against her, leveling a torrent of accusations, from bankrupting the nation and conspiring with foreign powers to orchestrating massacres. She answered them all with a calm, intelligent composure that stunned the court. But the prosecution had saved its most monstrous accusation for last. They brought forth her own son, Louis Charles, who had been brutally coached and likely abused by his captors. The boy was made to testify that his mother had committed incest with him. This accusation was so vile, so utterly beyond the pale of human decency, that it momentarily backfired. The crowd, which had been baying for her blood, fell into a stunned silence. When the judges pressed Marie Antoinette for a response, she remained silent, her face a mask of contemptuous disbelief. Finally, when one juror demanded an answer, she rose to her feet, and turning away from her accusers to address the women in the gallery, she spoke the most powerful words of her life. If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. I appeal to all mothers who may be present in this room. For a brief moment, a wave of sympathy, of shared humanity, rippled through the courtroom. But it was only a moment. The machinery of revolutionary justice was inexorable. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. The sentence was death. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken from her cell. Unlike the king, she was not granted the dignity of a closed carriage. Her hands were bound behind her back, and she was placed in an open cart, a common tumbril, for the slow, final journey through the streets of Paris. The crowds that lined the route screamed insults and spat at her. She sat ramrod straight, her face impassive, her gaze fixed on some distant point, seemingly oblivious to the hatred that surrounded her. At 12:15 p.m., she mounted the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution. Her last words, uttered to the executioner after she accidentally stepped on his foot, were simple and polite. "Pardon me, monsieur. I did not do it on purpose." A moment later, it was over. The executioner held her severed head aloft for the roaring crowd. When the news of her execution reached Axel von Fersen, the light in his world was permanently extinguished. His reaction was not one of explosive grief, but of a profound, soul-deep emptiness. The purpose that had driven him for years, the love that had been the central defining fact of his existence, was gone. All that was left was a hollow void and a burning, unquenchable hatred for the men who had murdered her. Although I was prepared for it, he wrote in his journal, the reality has prostrated me. I have lost everything in this world. The one that I loved, for whom I would have given 1,000 lives, is no more. His life was now in ruins. He dedicated what remained of it to two things: preserving her memory and seeking vengeance. He meticulously went through their correspondence, burning the most intimate passages to protect her honor from the judgment of posterity. He edited his own journals, cutting out anything that might cast a shadow on her name. He became the self-appointed guardian of her legacy, the high priest of her martyrdom. He also doubled down on his political activities, but they were no longer aimed at rescue. They were aimed at retribution. He supported the most extreme counter-revolutionary factions, his monarchism hardening into a rigid, unforgiving ideology. The revolution had taken everything from him, and he would spend the rest of his life fighting its influence. In 1794, his own life took another dramatic turn with the assassination of his great patron, King Gustav III of Sweden. With his staunchest ally gone, Fersen's political influence in the broader European counter-revolution began to wane. He eventually returned to Sweden, but he was a changed man returning to a changed country. He was no longer the dashing, celebrated young hero of the American War. He was a haunted, brooding figure in his 40s, a man whose personal tragedy was written on his face. He was seen as a relic of a bygone era, his fierce, uncompromising monarchism viewed as reactionary and out of step in a Europe that was being reshaped by Napoleonic ambition and revolutionary ideas. He re-entered Swedish politics, eventually rising to one of the highest offices in the kingdom, Lord Marshal of the realm. But he did so not with the ambition of a young man, but with the grim, joyless sense of duty of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. He was respected for his intelligence and integrity, but he was also feared and disliked for his cold, aloof demeanor and his unbending aristocratic pride. He made powerful enemies who resented his influence and saw him as an obstacle to their own ambitions. The Swedish public, influenced by the same revolutionary ideas he had fought so hard against, came to see him as a symbol of aristocratic arrogance and privilege. He had survived the French Revolution, but he had brought its shadow back home with him. The love that had given his life its meaning was buried in an unmarked grave in Paris. All that remained was a rigid code of honor and a profound bottomless well of grief. Axel von Fersen was now a ghost haunting the corridors of the Swedish court, a man whose personal tragedy was about to be cruelly and violently eclipsed by a political one, born from the very forces that had destroyed the woman he loved. Axel von Fersen's return to Sweden was a return to a ghost life. He moved through the gilded halls of the Swedish court and the corridors of power like a specter, his body present, but his soul buried in a mass grave in Paris. The fire that had once animated him, the passionate devotion, the ambitious drive, the chivalric honor, had been banked, leaving only the cold embers of duty and a profound, unyielding grief. He never married. He never sought personal happiness again. His life became a monument to what he had lost, a long, drawn-out epilogue to a story whose brilliant, tragic climax had already passed. He resumed his place at the apex of Swedish society, not through ambition, but through inheritance and a grim sense of obligation to his family name. He served the new Swedish king, Gustav IV Adolf, with a rigid loyalty, eventually rising to the highest ceremonial office in the kingdom, Lord Marshal of the realm. In this role, he was the master of court protocol, the enforcer of etiquette, the living embodiment of the aristocratic tradition he held so dear, but he was a man out Audimba. The revolutionary ideals he had fought so ferociously in France had seeped into the very air of Europe, Sweden included. His fierce, uncompromising monarchism, his belief in the absolute power of the king and the privileges of the nobility was no longer seen as honorable, but as arrogant, reactionary, and deeply out of touch. His public persona did little to help his case. The charm and grace that had captivated Versailles had hardened into a cold, aloof exterior. He was seen as haughty, severe, and contemptuous of those beneath him. He made no effort to court popularity. He despised the very idea of it. Popularity was the domain of the mob, the same fickle, bloodthirsty entity that had murdered his queen. This made him a deeply respected figure within the most conservative circles of the court, but it also made him a deeply hated one outside of them. To his political enemies and to a growing segment of the public, he was the perfect symbol of everything wrong with the old order, an arrogant aristocrat, blind to the changing world, clinging to the privileges of a bygone era. Sweden itself was in a state of turmoil. King Gustav IV Adolf's disastrous foreign policy had led to the loss of Finland to Russia in 1809, a national humiliation. This, combined with his increasingly erratic and autocratic rule, led to a military coup. The king was deposed and sent into exile. His uncle was placed on the throne as King Charles XIII, a frail, childless old man who was merely a placeholder. Sweden's most pressing problem was succession. To secure the future and appease the powerful military faction, a Danish prince, Christian August, was adopted and named Crown Prince of Sweden, taking the name Karl August. He was immensely popular, seen as a bluff, honest soldier who could stabilize the nation. Fersen and his political allies, the Gustavians, had opposed this choice. They favored the line of the deposed king Gustav IV Adolf's son. This placed Fersen in direct political opposition to the most popular figure in the country, further cementing his reputation as a reactionary obstructionist. Then, on May 28, 1810, disaster struck. While reviewing troops in the south of Sweden, the 41-year-old Crown Prince Karl August suddenly swayed in his saddle and fell from his horse, dead. The official cause of death, confirmed by autopsy and modern medical analysis, was a massive stroke. But in the feverish, paranoid atmosphere of the time, the truth was irrelevant. The nation was shocked and grief-stricken, and in its grief, it needed a villain. A simple, tragic death was not enough. It had to be an assassination, a conspiracy. A vicious, well-orchestrated smear campaign began almost immediately, and its targets were Axel von Fersen and his sister, the brilliant and equally formidable Countess Sophie Piper. The rumor spread like poison through whispers and anonymous pamphlets, was as simple as it was monstrous. The Fersens, leaders of the opposing Gustavian party, had poisoned the crown prince to clear the way for their own candidate. It was a complete and utter fabrication, but it was a believable one to a public already conditioned to hate and distrust him. His arrogance, his political opposition to the prince, his sister's reputation for courtly intrigue, it all fit together into a neat and damning narrative. His political enemies, eager to remove him from the board, fanned the flames of public outrage. Axel von Fersen, who had watched slander destroy a queen in France, was now to be the victim of the same insidious weapon in his own homeland. The day chosen for his public execution was June 20th, 1810, the 19th anniversary to the day of the flight to Varennes. The irony was as cruel as it was absolute. It was the day of Crown Prince Karl August's funeral procession through Stockholm. As Lord Marshal of the realm, Fersen was required by his office to lead the cortege. His friends, aware of the lynch mob atmosphere in the city, begged him not to go. They pleaded with him to feign illness, to let another take his place. But Fersen's rigid code of honor would not allow it. It was his duty, and he would perform it, regardless of the personal risk. To shirk his responsibility would be an act of cowardice, and perhaps in his heart, a part of him, a man who had been living a half-life for 17 years, no longer cared if he lived or died. He dressed in his full ceremonial regalia and entered his magnificent gilded state carriage. As the procession began to move through the narrow streets of Stockholm's Old Town, the mood of the massive crowd that had gathered was palpably hostile. The silence was broken by jeers, then by shouts, "Murderer! Fersen the poisoner!" The noise grew into a terrifying roar. Then the first stone was thrown, shattering a window of his carriage. The violence escalated with shocking speed. The crowd, which had been incited for weeks and was likely seeded with organized agitators, surged forward, overwhelming the few soldiers assigned to guard the procession. These guards, either intimidated by the mob's size or sympathetic to its cause, offered little resistance. The mob brought the carriage to a halt, tore open the doors, and dragged the 54-year-old Count out onto the cobblestones. What followed was an act of unspeakable barbarism, a political assassination disguised as spontaneous mob justice. He was beaten, kicked, and spat upon. He tried to seek refuge in a nearby house, but the doors were slammed in his face. He was dragged to the Ridderhustorget, the main square of the nobility, a final bitter irony. There, the mob finished its work. A sailor named Otto Johann Tandefeld was seen jumping on Fersen's chest, stomping the life out of him. Others bludgeoned him with their sticks and umbrellas. It was a slow, agonizing, and public slaughter. His sister, Sophie, watched the murder of her brother from a window overlooking the square, frozen in horror, before being spirited away to safety by friends. In the end, Axel von Fersen lay dead in the street, his fine uniform torn and bloodied, his body broken. The man who had survived the American Revolution, who had faced down the mobs of Paris, and who had navigated the treacherous courts of Europe, was murdered by his own people in his own city, the victim of a political lie. The official inquiries that followed were a farce. Although a handful of the rioters, including Tandefeld, were convicted, the powerful political figures who had orchestrated the smear campaign were never brought to justice. Months later, the Fersen family was officially and completely exonerated of the poisoning charge. It was proven to be a baseless slander, but it was too late. Axel von Fersen's brutal, unjust death served as a final, tragic eclipse. For nearly 2 centuries, his legacy was defined by 2 powerful but incomplete narratives. He was the romantic, devoted lover of Marie Antoinette, and he was the martyred victim of a political conspiracy. Both are true, but both obscure the deeper, more complex reality of the man himself. His violent end buried the quiet, enigmatic, and profound duality of his inner life. The whispers of his attractions to men, the subtle evidence of a soul that existed between the rigid categories of his time, were silenced by the roar of the mob and the grand, tragic sweep of his public story.